lecture. And our lecturer or conversationalist is Helen Clarke, who I will introduce a little later. There are 360 people attending this lecture from all around the world, so we hope that what we say will make a major contribution to peace-building discussions for the 21st century. And we have an excellent speaker and an excellent group of panelists that I'll introduce now. But before I do that, at about 5:30, we will have a Q&A session. And for those of you watching from home, at the bottom of your screens, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you have to write your question in there, and then Helen will answer it, or if you want to direct it to any of the other panelists, they'll answer it. My name's Kevin Clements, and I'm the chair of the Baxter Trust, and it's a great privilege to have Helen Clarke here to give the 8th Baxter Peace Lecture, which, as you know from the publicity, is actually a conversation. Helen really needs no introduction to most of you. She's one of New Zealand's most formidable politicians. She was chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Select Committee in the 1980s and played a major role in our anti-nuclear policy. She became a member of the cabinet in 1987 and then was deputy prime minister. And her other major achievement is that she's New Zealand's first elected woman prime minister, and she also led the Labour Party to 3 election victories. Her government opposed the US and British invasion of Iraq, and then after she left politics in New Zealand, she was a very admirable administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. So welcome, Helen, to this webinar. The 2 people that are joining me in asking questions are Ingrid Leary, who's a New Zealand politician. She was elected to the Taieri electorate in this last campaign. Prior to that election, she was a parliamentary press secretary, university lecturer and broadcaster. She set up the journalism school at the University of the South Pacific, and she received a New Zealand Special Service Medal for her broadcasting work in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean earthquake. She's also on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee and in the Ethnic Caucus in Parliament, and has earlier served in the British Council and has a very wide-ranging interest in the Pacific and in foreign affairs generally. And last but not least, Robert Patman is one of New Zealand's foremost international affairs commentators. He's been head of department at the University of Otago and directs and co-directs the Foreign Policy School, is often called upon to make comments about international affairs and international events, and has published about 11 books on international affairs. So we have a very wonderful and robust team of speakers and discussants, a robust team of a speaker and discussants. And so without any further ado, I will pose the first question to Helen, and then we'll move on from that. So I first met Helen when she was a very long-haired anti-Vietnam War activist. And so I'd like you to reflect a little bit, just to sort of give everybody some biographical detail on your evolution as a peace builder from anti-Vietnam War activist to anti-nuclear campaigner to the leader of the opposition, prime minister and then administrator in the UNDP. And what were the similarities and differences in your approach to peace building, and what were the long continuities that you brought to each of these positions and their peace building roles?
Well, great to be able to contribute to the Archibald Baxter Memorial Lecture Series. And sorry, it's not a lecture and it's not in person, but this is the best we can do in the pandemic age. I think our attitudes and our values are very much a product of a lot of different influences. And I've often reflected on the fact that my generation of New Zealanders grew up with family members who had served in World War I. Indeed, I had a great uncle by marriage who served in the Boer War, as we called it then, the South African War. And of course, my parents' generation was the World War II generation. Now, these wars inflicted incredible casualties and death toll on New Zealand, and I grew up knowing those stories. And my grandmother's hall was always 2 very fine portraits of my grandfather's two brothers who didn't come back from World War One. One died in Gallipoli and one died of the flu in camp. And there were two other great uncles in other parts of the family who died. My grandfather was a veteran of the Somme and probably survived because he was gassed a few weeks before the end of the war. So, you grew up with this in your background, the stories of the people who never came back. World War II, I had an uncle by marriage who was a prisoner in German prisoner of war camps, captured in North Africa. I had my father's older brother who served in the Solomon Islands and came back very ill with malaria and probably other issues as well. So this was the family background. I grew up thinking that war was pretty tough, and I didn't like it at all. So when I went to university, I naturally gravitated to what was going on at the time with the protests against the Vietnam War, the protests against the nuclear weapon testing in the Pacific. And I was part of a generation that questioned the direction that New Zealand had taken. When there was a war on, we tended to have our hand up first. We managed to declare war on the Germans in World War One before the British, as I recall, because of the time zone issues. So I came into politics with a very skeptical view of all this and thinking you really need good reason to be sending people offshore. I often think some of the most devastating displays you can see in our museums are those ones which have a map of New Zealand, and when you touch the interactive map, all the lights go up as to where the casualties were in World War One. There wasn't a hamlet untouched by it, and that certainly affected me as a young person. So I came into politics with that background, as leader of the opposition with that background, and then as PM. And of course, as PM, we had to deal with the aftermath of 9/11, then the American excursion with very few friends into Iraq. We had to take stands on these things. And I often used to say on the campaign trail to young people that to your generation, Iraq is what Vietnam was to us. And that as someone from the Vietnam War generation, there was no way on earth that I would lead New Zealand into an adventure in Iraq, which had no sanction or cover from the Security Council. I went on to UNDP, and UNDP was very much, an organisation that was into looking up what were the drivers of conflict, what were the issues that were stopping countries developing peacefully. So I brought that perspective from New Zealand into that kind of work as well, and happy to say a little bit more about that.
Okay, Robert.
Helen, thank you very much for that. The question really burning in my mind is how you understand and characterize, if you like, the global environment, because sometimes it's depicted as being binary, that is between the United States and China, the great powers who shape the world, or do you see it as being an international transition? And if you do see it as the world being in a major transition, do you believe this transition will ultimately lead to a more peaceful international order, or in fact a less peaceful international order?
The former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Jan Eliasson, who's a veteran Swedish diplomat, used to say, "I'm an optimist, but I'm a worried optimist." So I think that's the approach I take to this question. Look, I grew up in the era of the Cold War, when the dynamics between the United States and the Soviet Union were obviously, very, very toxic, shall we say. And then we went through that period of the collapse of the Soviet Union before Russia began to, reform and reassert its geopolitical ambitions. And alongside that has come the rise of China, and that's the major transition. And it's probably fair to say that in human history, the rise of a new power in the bloc has never been without its tensions and challenges. And we see all that played out now. And for us in New Zealand, look, we're not unique among countries. For most countries now, probably China is their biggest trading partner. that's the size and power of the Chinese economy. So while in modern Western democratic societies there are going to be things, and perhaps quite a number, about Chinese policy and treatment of people that we can't abide, nonetheless we have to deal with the real world of China and also the economic force that it is. And I'm inclined to think that if we think that China can be remade in the image of the West, we're dreaming. This is a futile quest, particularly if it's trying to be enforced by outside pressure. So I think we need, in this transition to a new order, we need to be getting the diplomacy handbook out again and looking at how we work through differences while also identifying what is in our common interest. And clearly, many things are in our common interest. I mean, if we're going to have future better responses to pandemic, we'd better get China on board with that quest. If we're going to deal with the climate crisis, we'd better have China on board with that quest. If we're going to deal with biodiversity, the state of our oceans, the end to global poverty and hunger, trying to have more preventive action against conflict, China's a player in all of this. So if we reduce relationships to slingshots at China, I don't think this is very productive. And this is what concerns me, that the tools being employed now in this transition are I think somewhat counterproductive. I mean, that would probably lead me to make an observation about this new agreement that Australia, the UK and the US have entered into. It's got the most ghastly acronym. I think we'll call it AUKUS. That's what it seems to be. And I'm so glad it's not AUKUS NZ. This is not a club to be in, because to me it's a bit like the last gasp of the imperial Anglosphere, to be proclaiming that somehow it can be a force for peace in the quote Indo-Pacific, the lingo of the day. I can't see that this is really very constructive. And when you end up with an initiative like that simultaneously alienates one of Europe's great powers, France, you have Indonesia cancelling a prime ministerial visit, you have the Malaysians up in arms, the rest of ASEAN not saying much, but looking and saying, what is this? And then, of course, the issue of China, which will see it, and I think with justification, as aimed at it. So I don't think this transition is being handled terribly well, if I could put it that way.
Ingrid.
Thank you.
Yeah, Helen, you've mentioned the Security Council. You have mentioned behaviours that perhaps don't sit with our New Zealand values. And you also mentioned diplomacy. But I guess at some point there needs to be accountability. And so my question really, given that you've worked inside the UN, and I have seen firsthand the fantastic work the UN can do in places like the Pacific, but with the veto through the Security Council, is the UN fit for purpose these days in order to be able to hold countries to account, or what other mechanisms might we need in order to be able to bring behaviours into line with what we might find acceptable or aligned with ours?
Well, we're not going to get that kind of response from the Security Council as currently configured. It hasn't, to date, been able to do anything sensible on Myanmar, and it's struggled to do anything on the Tigray conflict. It struggles on Yemen. It struggles on many things because behind actors in conflicts, there's generally other actors who are supplying or encouraging or giving cover, and all of the above apply to countries that should be at the focus of attention of the Security Council. I put a lot of hope really in one of the UN's truly independent organisations, which is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the various mechanisms of the High Commissioner and also of the Human Rights Council, problematic as that is, to raise issues and expose serious human rights abuses. I think the universal periodic review process that the Human Rights Council undertakes is a good one. I was involved in that not only as PM when the Cabinet would see the report which New Zealand would make against that periodic review, but at UNDP we used to assist countries to prepare their reports and try to engage civil society, even in environments where civil society struggled to be recognised or be able to operate freely. So I formed the impression that the Universal Periodic Review was really pretty positive. I think that the special rapporteurs can do very good work, and the High Commissioner herself or himself can also use the independent power of voice to the full. I must say I'm a little concerned that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights agreed to do a joint investigation in the case of Tigray with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. I don't think this is the right course at all. I think it's very important that the independence of the office to undertake investigations on its own account and not in cooperation with the National Human Rights Institution when it's the policies of government forces which are at issue. That's a line that's been breached in my opinion. But nonetheless, the best tool for accountability we have on these kinds of issues are the human rights mechanisms.
Following up on that, if I might ask a question now, Helen, the Secretary General has just come up with a new common agenda for this session of the UN, and he's hoping it'll hasten progress on the SDGs and engender more global solidarity and new social contracts between citizens and peoples. How effective do you think that's likely to be? Is it simply a rehash of a lot of the old aspirations which we had a few years ago, or is it something new? And will this common agenda really help the UN deal with climate change, pandemics, and that close linkage between the development and peacebuilding agenda?
Well, my attitude is that we have to back it. The General Assembly called for it as an outcome of the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN. And the Secretary General has gone away, and I understand there's been a lot of consultation out to the wider world. I haven't followed the way they did it, but if they did it the way we sort of did backup consultations for the SDGs, there's probably been online consultation and engagement with civil society. I understand the member states feel they may not have been consulted enough, but their opportunity is now, because the report is going to have to be, picked up and taken forward in some way. I think what Antonio Guterres is trying to do is reboot multilateralism, which has been at a very low ebb. The Trump era was very difficult and contributed, I think, to greater polarization. Now the new administration, the US, the Biden administration, has very much come with the message we're back at the UN, and it's fair to say they are back at the UN and playing I think a good role there. So the time is right to try something like this, although of course it comes against the background dynamics of the US-China debate, US-Russia, many complexities there. So what he's calling for is a summit of the future to be held in 2023, which would be preceded by a lot of consultation and events. And I think in New Zealand, we need to get in behind that, probably through the UN Association branches here, maybe international affairs, maybe professors of international politics. I mean, we need to see what would we like to see at such a summit, and like to see our own country saying there. Antonio has also put on the table the idea of a 2-yearly dialogue involving the G20 finance ministers and ECOSOC. And that's been around for a while. He and I have discussed that or led discussions on that kind of idea at the UN Chief Executives Board years ago. It's trying to get the UN back as a forum for more serious economic discussion and not see that gravitate off to the 20 countries who represent 85% of the world economy. The UN's always felt cut out of that. So I think that's a good initiative. There's another initiative in it, which is to convene a World Social Summit, I think, for 2025. Now, that is something that the Club de Madrid, a grouping of democratically elected former leaders, which I'm part of, had pushed in the consultations on this common agenda report. And we feel that because in particular, the human development goals and the sustainable development goals are in such a shocking state, progress knocked for 6 by the pandemic, but it wasn't great before that, that the time has come to sort of go back to the spirit of the Copenhagen Summit of 1995, which was led by Juan Somavia, who was the Chilean permanent representative to the UN in New York at the time, and later served 4 terms as head of the ILO. Go back to that and see if we can breathe new life into the UN's leadership on social policy and human development advances. So look, as I say, all things considered, we have to back it. It's a well-researched and put together paper. Look, if we just take the attitude of, more words, nothing will happen, well, nothing will happen. I think we need to mobilize civil society and broader constituencies advising governments and active in international affairs and development debate around the world to get in behind this and see if we can make the best of it.
Great, that's a very optimistic statement for all of us to rally around. Robert.
Helen, interested in your views on the UN Security Council, because I think many of us in New Zealand and elsewhere in the world are conscious that the UN is not fulfilling its role in peace building and in security matters generally, and the veto is a major problem because it often renders the UN Security Council dysfunctional. You mentioned Tigray, for example. The UN Security Council often very slow to respond to crucial developments because one of the parties has a political stake in the outcome. Do you get a sense with your international travel and consultations that the members of the General Assembly are getting a little bit impatient with the use of the veto? And what do you think is the way forward? How can we get the permanent 5, who have a privilege that no one else does in the UN organization, how can we get them to either circumscribe their use of the veto or in fact consider getting rid of it?
Well, I suppose it's an old maximum that those who've got power don't give it up within a struggle. But I think you're right, the UN General Assembly is a bit fed up. And for example, on Myanmar, the UN General Assembly passed a pretty strong resolution. And, that sort of resolution you'd like to see coming out of the Security Council, but because the Myanmar junta has protection there, it hasn't come out. It's also been difficult to get the Security Council to take the responsibility to protect principle seriously. And I think actually responsibility to protect was a terrible setback when the Security Council did agree to act on the issue of Libya, when the former President Gaddafi started threatening to kill everyone who opposed him. And that then turned into a regime change exercise by Western powers, and arguably has made it a lot harder to get consensus on the Security Council when there is a need to intervene to protect populations. I think I'm right in recalling that there is in the UN Charter a review mechanism, a review conference mechanism. And there has been some discussion over the years as to whether there should be initiated a conference to review the Charter. Now, of course, you go down that road with some caution because you don't want to end up with something worse. And if you think, of another parallel document, the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think many of us feel you'd never get such a declaration negotiated now. But it is worth considering whether a review conference to put the issues on the table of the obsolescence of the current Security Council structure would be a good idea. Look, the attempts to reform it have obviously gone back for years. When I was PM, we debated at the Cabinet External Relations Committee what our stand would be on the proposal to expand the council by 4 permanent members, namely Brazil, India, Japan and Germany. And then as part of that package, there would have been 2 permanent seats for Africa and 1 for Eastern Europe. It became a Christmas tree, really, and never went anywhere. And one of the reasons it never went anywhere was because few were prepared to see the veto power given to new permanent members, because they thought that would make it even harder to get agreement on anything. So it is like trying to solve the Rubik's Cube. But again, you're not going to get to reform by one swing of the wheel. It needs some process, some considered mechanisms, and ever a long, slow, deliberate build-up to a review conference on the Charter was the way to approach it. It would be worth taking those steps. It won't be quick. Meanwhile, as you say, that there's the proposal that comes up from time to time of would you get agreement on the Security Council to restrict the use of the veto in particular circumstances. And those circumstances obviously should be when confronted with genocide or something else constituting a very serious war crime or crime against humanity. And the French did initiate a process for consideration of use of such self-restraint. But again, that has foundered in recent years as well. But I think it's a noble endeavour to try to enforce that discipline on Security Council members.
Ingrid.
Yeah, we've talked about Myanmar, and Afghanistan actually in particular has kept the Foreign Affairs Select Committee very busy, and MPs as well. And I guess wearing my New Zealand Parliamentarian Women's hat, I'm really concerned about the reports coming out from Afghanistan about women not being able to go to work, not being able to go into tertiary education and so on. And I'm wondering at what point with regimes such as in Afghanistan and in Myanmar, is it acceptable to have managed dialogue to deal with these issues, or is it never acceptable to recognise an illegitimate regime, in your view?
Well, if we take the New Zealand position, certainly up to and including my time as PM, and I haven't researched whether it's still the same, but we never gave recognition to anyone. We said, infer from our actions what the state of our relationship with a country is. So we didn't issue statements of recognition, and I'd be very surprised if we did in this case. But look, everything we thought would be bad about the Taliban is bad about the Taliban. Let's add to your list, Ingrid, that they haven't allowed girls to go back to secondary school yet. Some brave universities have been holding classes with a curtain down the middle, separating the men and the women, which is, of course, ridiculous. So it's bad, and there's also some indications that the worst elements within the alliance, which is the Taliban, the Haqqani network, of course, have pretty much the upper hand, and they're in charge of internal security and so on. So what to do? I mean, the UN emergency coordinator has been there, emergency relief coordinator Martin Griffiths, very experienced US diplomat who has been a special envoy in Yemen and a good man. And the Security Council did pass a resolution on Afghanistan, and it basically said to the Taliban, if you want to be able to deal with the international community, you have to guarantee safe passage for those who wish to leave and have visas to go somewhere else. You have to allow humanitarian access, And you have to uphold human rights, including for women and girls. Well, the last one obviously would not really be in their nature. And we're still waiting for the safe passage, aren't we? I mean, we have a list of, I think, 250 to 300 people who will have visas to enter New Zealand. We haven't seen them on a plane yet. And again, the Taliban will be bargaining over this. Well, what do we get for letting you fly a plane in and take people out? So it's extremely difficult, but there does have to be dialogue at the appropriate level around these issues. So it's good that the Emergency Relief Coordinator from the UN went. Dr. Tedros actually messaged me from Afghanistan last night. It shows the internet's still working, at least in his accommodation. I mean, he's gone because the health system's in collapse, and they have a runaway COVID pandemic on top of all the normal health challenges of one of the world's poorest, least developed countries. I think I also saw that Peter Mora, former Swiss ambassador to the UN, who's now the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, has also been. So at that level, there's a lot of action. Now, UN Women very bravely decided not to withdraw all its international staff. It has stayed and kept the door open in Kabul, and it's advocating like crazy for women and girls. UNICEF is there. World Food Programme's there. UNHCR is there. The UN agencies on particularly in the humanitarian sphere, and UN Women advocating for women and girls, that they're standing and trying to deliver. I think that's where we have to focus our efforts at the moment, because this population of Afghanistan is somewhere between 35 and 40 million people, of whom somewhere around half, UN says 18 million, are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. This is huge, and so regardless of what we think of those who for now hold power in Kabul, we can't desert the people of Afghanistan. I sometimes think, we obviously put a lot of attention, global media attention, on the refugees and evacuees, and they need to be supported, including here. But most people can't evacuate or leave. Most people are stuck there with, again, one of the world's worst regimes, looming famine, and a lot of other humanitarian challenges. So let's focus on that level too, the people who can't leave, are left behind.
Helen, you made an absolutely brilliant decision not to join allies in the war against Iraq. Do you have any regrets about committing troops to Afghanistan? Well,
I usually adopt a no regrets attitude to life, because I feel you made the best decisions that you could with the advice that you had at the time. And of course, hindsight's always a wonderful thing. I think that the quest to rid Afghanistan of Al Qaeda was the right quest, and let's not forget that 2 New Zealand citizens died in the 9/11 attacks as well. But we did send the SAS 3 times. Then the Chief of Defence, Bruce Ferguson, advised me and the Minister of Defence that he would not recommend sending them again. He said the job that they were sent to do is over. If you send them, you're wasting what we train the SAS for. They shouldn't be there as a police force. They should come home and get on with training for some other emergency. What we did agree to was a non-combat force in the Provincial Reconstruction Team, and I visited them in late 2003, not long after they'd gone. I mean, the mission of supporting the state to extend its authority might sound a bit amorphous, but was not unimportant. I did feel, watching from afar, like thousands of miles away after I left office, that the mission of New Zealand had changed a bit. But I don't really have much to say about that, because I can only take responsibility for what I did myself. I do have a view, though, on the disorderly departure, if you like, of foreign forces from Afghanistan. I think that the peace and stability of Afghanistan, a landlocked country with a history of significant internal instability and being pressured by major powers from far and near down through the millennia, that a fragile country like that, a failed state, as the Taliban left, and it's almost a miracle to graduate from failed state to fragile state, and they're back to failed state again. This is never going to settle in 20 years. And in a strange way, that quite small residual presence of foreign forces did enable some space for a government to try to govern at the central and regional and local level, and to slowly, painfully push forward on some of the major development challenges. And what we saw happen in August pulled the rug under all of that and took us back to where we were 20 years ago. And I think that's reprehensible. And I don't think it need have ended that way. But again, if we replay the record, once the Taliban had lost power, the US attention to Afghanistan did wane rather quickly. By April 2002, the US was consulting the UK on the invasion of Iraq. There's some evidence, and this has been well reported in the New York Times, that the Taliban defeated, but never went away, because they go home to the village basically, did seek inclusion in the Loya Jirga that was held in 2002. Hamid Karzai is said to have wanted that. The US didn't want it. So they were excluded. And what we know is if you exclude, you have hostages for the future of problems. So the Taliban never went away. The US attention was diverted. There wasn't a serious enough investment in sustained development. And having been into just 2.5 years ago off the beaten track in the west of Afghanistan, I have to say that it's all very well for the West to say it spent trillions in Afghanistan. It didn't spend it on human development. There's people living there in circumstances that have barely changed in centuries. And in that kind of environment, a fundamentalist movement like the Taliban will get traction. It never went away. Towards the end of my time at UNDP, it was conventional wisdom that the Taliban controlled at least 60 to 70% of the country. What they couldn't do was hold towns and cities. They would sort of roll into town on the pickup trucks, kill the police commander, put the flag up, take the YouTube video, tweet about it, and then when the army finally got around to coming, leave town again. And what the signalling at the start of the fighting season this year did, that the foreign forces would be gone by the end of August, was really an open invitation to grab as much territory as you could before they went and established new facts on the ground. And that, actually, the way it played out was more spectacularly successful for them than they could ever have envisaged. So books will be written about this, movies will be made about it. I envisage the Hurt Locker equivalents in the next year or so. But as I say, for the people left behind, the upwards of 35 million, it's a pretty grim outlook.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Just turning to something completely different, I guess. If we look at the direction that technology is going and the threats that now are upon us, not just geopolitical ones, but technological ones, what's your view about how we mitigate the risks of autonomous weapons and what we can do as a little country in the bottom of the South Pacific to perhaps lead some dialogue or lead some action around securing our future? Because the reality seems rather alarming in terms of what people can do across the world with these weapons.
Well, this is not something I've had time to research, but I am very worried because, you know, we have a history, you know, as a world, particularly in this century, of negotiating different kinds of treaties and conventions to control types of weaponry. And, you know, for New Zealand, one of the great causes of my generation has been, you know, to pursue, you know, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And didn't we get a rather nice UN General Assembly convention negotiated? You know, we've seen the Ottawa Convention on landmines, we've seen Chemical Weapons Convention, still rather weak biological weapons international law. In the nuclear arms treaty architecture, there's been a lot of treaties between what was the Soviet Union, US. Sadly, the Trump era began to demolish a number of those, and they need new life breathed into them. And then, you know, if you look at the whole issue with Iran, it's been about, you know, trying to see that there's not a nuclear capacity. So, you know, the world's got form on at least trying to get effective arms control international legal instruments in place. And what you're alluding to, Ingrid, is a whole new area that's really, yeah, it's a free fire zone, right? Whether it's the use of AI, cyber attacks, drone attacks, lethal autonomous weapons, we don't have effective international treaty control architecture at all. And it, you know, it leads me to make a comment about this shocking drone attack sent from a bunker somewhere in the US, one assumes, if not a ship offshore, that was said to be dealing to a suicide bomber from ISIS-K near Kabul airport, and instead killed a local aid worker and another, I think, 9 or 10 members of his family. It reminded me of the Eye in the Sky movie, a brilliant British movie of 2015 with Helen Mirren in it, which showed the discussion going on behind the scenes of the people who sat operating the drones as to whether they should go after the reported presence of an al-Shabaab commander at a certain time, because that was the time a little girl went to collect water from the well. Well, in the end, the little girl collecting water from the well was killed. And it's not fiction, that film, right? It's really describing the kinds of decisions that people are making with this remote warfare, which completely distances them from the object of the attack. So I think it's deeply worrying, and I think we need a lot more discussion. Maybe something the UN's disarmament affairs people could with encouragement give more attention to.
And Kevin, if I may, just a supplementary on that, perhaps not as dramatic, but cyber warfare. We've seen cyber attacks happening more and more frequently. How worried should we be, and what should we be doing to secure ourselves from those?
Well, again, not new. I mean, when I was PM, you know, every day the sort of cyber protection wall we try to build was under attack for elements of basic infrastructure. And that will go on, and I'm afraid it's not always popular to say so, but bodies like GCSB have to be supported to help the various, you know, parts of the New Zealand government apparatus, commercial apparatus, university apparatus, whatever, to be protected against cyber threats. I mean, it's certainly a way to bring a country to its knees without firing a shot.
Robert?
Oh, Helen, I wonder if I could ask you about another trouble spot, Myanmar. In February, of course, there was a military coup there. And since then, the government has acted in the new junta has acted in a most repressive fashion. More than 1,000 people killed, many of whom were unarmed protesters, and more than 6,000 people detained. And they're being backed now by the Chinese and the Russians. And I just wondered what liberal democracies could do, given the fact that the military regime in Myanmar has such powerful backers who seem determined to support the government there. What can liberal democracies do to try to give voice back to the government that was displaced in that coup, an elected government, and the people that support it?
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's obviously a terrible crisis for Myanmar, and it's a crisis for ASEAN. And I think, you know, while ASEAN had its conference and agreed on its 5-point consensus statement about what needs to be done, but hasn't had much success in the junta taking a great deal of notice of it. We also need to back the office of the Special Envoy of the UN. That the person who holds that office is due to change pretty soon, and we await news as to who it is. There's a range of rumours, but listening to the debate about how this might play out, there is a view, and I think this is right, that something will change when the US and China get further on the same page with respect to Myanmar. And I don't think we should assume that China's necessarily that happy about what's happened. China had a good relationship with the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. I don't think they welcomed this. China doesn't like instability on its border. It may be a bit hoist on its own petard of saying, "Oh, we don't interfere in people's internal affairs," quote unquote. But I don't think it's that happy. Now, it has, of course, positioned itself alongside the new regime, but that may also give it, some scope for leverage. There is a Chinese business sector in Myanmar, and some of those interests have come under attack. So that starts to concern China. If there's more instability in the bordering regions of China, that disturbs it. So I think that the dialogue with China about Myanmar is extremely important at governmental level, at multilateral level in New York. I think just whatever opportunities we have through whatever the East Asia Forum is called these days, the ASEAN Plus arrangements, China, I don't think, is giving the regime a free pass. Yes, it's given some protection, along with Russia, to the junta and the Security Council, but I'm not sure it's overly happy. And I think, again, twin track diplomacy is important, and the kind of relationships our academic and think tank community have with China to really see whether it can support a move away from this. Meanwhile, as you say, Robert, a lot of people have been killed, a lot of people have been tortured, a lot of people are detained, a lot of people are displaced, a lot of people have fled to the border to try to find refuge. It's extremely repressive and distressing. The economy is in free fall. The humanitarian needs are great. The COVID-19 pandemic is running unmitigated, and it was reported in recent days that the health minister of the junta was refusing international support. I tangentially have a responsibility as chair of the board of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, of which Myanmar was a member. Now, we suspended its membership very promptly after the coup because we had credible reports that the civil society part of the Myanmar EITI operation could not operate freely. But what we've observed is that, what I particularly observed, that I'm to speak for EITI on this, is that the junta actually has its own, financing supply lines. It controls a number of sectors of the economy. It gets a lot of revenues through now the companies it controls that are coming out of oil and gas, for example. Diamonds, construction, they're there. So it's not necessarily of great concern to the Myanmar military that the economy's collapsed, because they'll just see that as putting greater pressure on the people. I don't think it's a particular concern to them that people are going hungry, because that puts pressure on the people to, comply with their rule. So I think we're dealing with very, very cynical people. And I think that outside pressure is important. I think using all international instruments, including the ideally a threat from the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court of going after those who have carried out the kinds of crimes that it has the power to investigate. I think there's just got to be a lot of different pressures coming on to try to get some path back to acceptable government.
That sort of reminds me about, how do you, as a former UNDP administrator and committed to multilateralism, how do you maintain momentum in relation to multiple crises which come on your plate simultaneously? I mean, we've already tonight sort of put on the plate, Tigray and Afghanistan and Myanmar and Syria and so forth. So how do you ensure that the world's attention isn't fickle? and how do you prioritize between all of these humanitarian catastrophes?
Well, unfortunately, there's what we call these days the CNN effect, that, you've got 24/7 coverage, and then the next crisis comes along and they're off after that. Poor Afghanistan. While the West was evacuating people, we got 24/7 coverage. Once the last planes left, the attention had already gone to the hurricane in Louisiana. And we don't see Afghanistan leading the news much anymore, unless you go to Al Jazeera, based in Qatar, which has more interest in covering it. Similarly, Tigray never had the attention that it should have had. There's a list of war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed there that are as long as your arm. Crimes of war crime of using starvation as a tool of war, rape as a tool of war, arguably genocide, actually. The list is long, and yet you can't get Security Council action on it. Look, I have to say, while we probably feel we're in the middle of one of these perfect storms at the moment, with not only a huge number of conflicts, but all these other huge challenges, from climate change to pandemics to a long list. When I was at the UN, it was not dissimilar. There was a country that was internally combusting and creating extreme humanitarian need and suffering, by the week, by the month. So it's very, very difficult. And I think when, the UN, of course, is an Aunt Sally that everybody loves to bash, but I can assure you that the midnight hours are burned there as people wrestle with what on earth can we do? Yeah. What can we do that will make a difference? And if you have a Security Council that's so polarized it can't move, then you are reduced to being, the pleaders for humanitarian support. And we know that's not the answer. It's critical, and it's not addressing the drivers of the conflict.
I'm wondering, Helen, would how much does trade play into this, values-based trade, and how can we use values-based trade to get the type of behaviours that are consistent with our values?
Well, look, I suppose one of the problems I have with that is that if we only trade with those who have democratic values like ours, it's going to be a very small list. So I think that the issue is how we find ways of securing our own living standards. And let's face it, they're not that great for a lot of Kiwis either, particularly with the extreme pressures of the housing crisis and the fact that we're living in a pandemic, and even with wage subsidies, it doesn't enable everybody to put food on the table. A lot of small business in trouble. So, of course, every government has to have an eye to the economic security of its people and the viability of the country. But that shouldn't stop you using the other tools at your disposal in diplomacy and the power of your voice to be playing a role in addressing some of these, extremely serious problems that the world faces. And we're in our common humanity, we want to be able to try to make a difference to the extent we can with our small size, present, voice and purse.
Robert?
Well, Helen's already touched on Tigray, which was my next question, and I'm also conscious there's lots of people who want to ask questions. So why don't I, give way and let things proceed? Okay,
that sounds good. Although I do want to ask one final question, Helen. You as a woman have been an exemplary leader and role model for women. And Resolution 1325 was sort of intended to put women in much more active roles in relation to kind of peacekeeping, peace building, and so forth. What do you see as progress in relation to the numbers of women involved in these issues? And how do we make sure that more women are at the table?
Well, I think if you were really cynical, you'd say the main progress was getting the Security Council resolution passed, and then it has been sort of augmented with subsequent resolutions. But a lot of people are very critical of what's come of it, and certainly it hasn't led to any greater protection of women in war zones. Or protection against sexual violence in conflict. There are those who say, and I think they're right, that the resolution really didn't particularly understand the structural issues of gender inequality. So you can't just kind of add on, oh, we'll have women at the table. You have to look at what can you do to support the women to be able to come forward and participate in societies where their voices haven't been heard in the past. The resolution also, of course, lacks enforcement. There was a debate on these issues in the Security Council earlier in the year, and the Under-Secretary General, who's the special representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, spoke and invoked Resolution 1325 and said, what is the use of it if the UN isn't prepared to act in the face of the horrible evidence from Tigray of the rape of women? So yeah, I think it's all very well to pass a resolution, but then you have to see it driven to make a real difference to people's lives, and they're not seeing that. And I must say, when you see the sometimes coverage of teams of negotiators, I mean, how many women did you see on the Taliban side of Doha? Well, the answer's obvious, isn't it? If you think of the Havana talks between the Colombian government and the FARC, well, no women. So the women are still kind of left, lucky to get into the second or third row, or really left very much in auxiliary roles and no role at all of the question of the Taliban. So to date, not a great success, it would be my opinion, but we live in hope that some real effort might be put into it.
Great. Well, we have a large number of different questions coming up here. So I'll just sort of start them off, and then you can roll through them. Kia Helen, I'm interested in our Prime Minister's actions. My question is, what was it like to be Prime Minister during the major upheaval of the Iraq War?
Yes, well, I remember it well because I became aware in the first half of 2002 that there was a serious discussion going on in London and in Washington, DC, about an invasion of Iraq, and it seemed to be, in a way, driven by those in George Bush Jr.'s administration who felt that his father's administration hadn't finished the job at the end of the Kuwait War. Often people say, did the New Zealand government come under pressure to participate? And I say no, because we made it clear where we stood.
Okay.
And as it began to heat up with the various discussions at the Security Council, because you'll recall that British Prime Minister Tony Blair kept saying he would prefer to have Security Council cover for the intervention. Not that the lack of it stopped him in the end. But we were actively networking with other like-minded countries at that time to say, this is wrong and the Security Council shouldn't approve this. And in saying that, it wasn't that we were giving any support or solace to Saddam Hussein's regime. It was clearly a dreadful regime, but I think I've been around long enough to know that it's best if a country's own citizens find ways of dealing with those regimes rather than trying to impose change from outside. And of course, the last 18 years has been a pretty shocking period for Iraq, as all the consequences of the invasion and spillover impacts ensued. So, I have no doubt that we made the right decision to stay out. And if you think of the little core Anglosphere of US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, well, we had one friend, and that was Canada, John Chrétien, who was Prime Minister at the time. But it didn't feel lonely because most of the world did not support the invasion and didn't think good would come of it.
Great. Kia ora, Helen. This is Angus Noon. Do you think the prospect of New Zealand becoming a republic is sensible, and would you support a referendum?
Well, I'm on the record as saying that I think it is inevitable that New Zealand will become a republic. But it's one thing to say that, then there's what is the mechanism. And I think it would need a lot of public dialogue. It would need a very long and considered process, because I would think that in order to change constitutional status, we would need to think in more detail about the constitutional arrangements, what sort of presidency would be involved. I myself would favour something like the Irish or Israeli style presidencies, which are very important in setting the sort of tone for the country, but the presidency sits above politics, a bit the way I guess we've positioned Governor Generals over the years. Obviously, the issue of the treaty will arise, and that won't be a straightforward or easy discussion either. There'll be a lot of debate about that. So, yeah, I think the debate now should focus on do we want a debate, and if we do, how do we want to conduct it? This is not a matter for one parliamentary term or two. This is quite a long debate, and I wouldn't rush it, but I would say that it's inevitable that the issue has to be raised, broached, addressed, discussed. You try to find a way forward.
Okay, I have one here from Sean Kavanagh. The lawyer Polly Higgins, 1966 to 219, advocated for an amendment to the Rome Statute to ensure environmental destruction became the fifth international crime against peace ecocide law. Given that New Zealand has a duty of care to Pacific Island states facing sea level rise, shouldn't New Zealand support this initiative? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there is a basis for discussing such a crime of ecocide. One of the most shocking examples of such a crime, in my view, was the destruction of the buffalo on the North American plains, which literally destroyed the way of life and sustenance of indigenous peoples. And it seems that the buffaloes weren't really killed for meat or skins. They were killed to destroy the indigenous culture and, in effect, remove people to reservations and try and destroy a people. So there is a basis for discussion. Whether one would want to take it as far as the direction suggested in the question, I don't know. I mean, what we do know with the climate change challenge is that those who've done the least to cause the crisis carry the biggest burden from it, whether it's low-lying atolls or the arid lands from the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, and so on. I mean, I suppose the issue in my mind is it constructive to criminalise what causes this, or should we really focus on the mitigation and the adaptation, which could make a difference for people in the near and medium term.
Andrew Hammond says, Kia ora, Helen, what do you think is going to be the greatest challenge for my generation in influencing global politics? Thanks, Kenzie, age 17.
Well, I think the greatest challenge is going to be with the next generation across regions, great powers, small powers, can find a way of really pursuing an agenda like the one the Secretary General set out to build a common future rather than pitting us against each other. So will we find a solution to the climate crisis? We haven't found it yet. We have the Paris Agreement, which is more observed in the breach, as it were. When you have an agreement that everyone signs up to that says the aspiration is to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and then the world's nations collectively commit to do things which add up to a path towards 3.2 degrees global warming. This is farcical. Can we find it within us as an international community to take the steps we need to take to stop another pandemic? We could make this the last pandemic, but not if we approach the next one like this one. So we've got these big existential challenges, and the issue is whether the common cause can be found across the geopolitical divides, or could we actually diminish the geopolitical divides to deal with these issues responsibly. After all, the reason for multilateralism is to address problems which are too large for any one nation state to address on its own. And we've got plenty of those challenges. But we're not rising to the challenge of addressing them. So that's the big challenge I see for the generation that's 17 today.
Okay. Here's one. We're living amidst severe polarization, a battle between democracy versus authoritarianism, nationalism versus globalism. Are you concerned about the possible rise of racism, xenophobia, and far-right extremism as New Zealand society deals with recent terrorist attacks?
Well, I mean, the mosque murders confronted us with that possibility, where we had a white xenophobic nationalist, as it were, deciding he would go out and kill people who were different from him. So there is that risk. A relatively tolerant country like Norway had its horrific murderer who killed young people associated with the ruling party. So yes, it's a risk. And it's a risk we should confront, not by investing mega bucks in internal security and surveillance, but in addressing what brings communities together rather than drives them apart. The New Zealand society has changed a great deal, particularly I would say in the last 30 years or so. Much more diverse, with communities of scale among the newer communities. But how much do we mix across those communities? I think we need to put a lot of effort from the community initiative level up to what the tone government set and the work that's done through ethnic affairs ministries, local councils, to show that we can live together as neighbours in our diversity. And you can make diversity a strength, but you need to invest in doing that.
This is from Germana Barber, founder of Women in Action in Switzerland. Helen, thinking about democracies, could you mention the 3 top things, legislative or otherwise, that need to be implemented in order to substantially accelerate gender balance?
Well, of course, there are a lot of countries around the world which still have laws on the law book which institutionalise gender inequality. So those need to go. In a lot of cases, though, gender inequality is stemming not from a bad law, but from just, culture, the way things have always been. And so you need to address that from within, as it were. I mean, one of the most critical investments, I think, is in girls' education, because education is empowering, gives girls as they become women, so many more options for the future, and then also the power and the voice to be advocating for something different. I think one of the biggest challenges is that of sexual and gender-based violence, which is a pernicious scourge globally, and including in our own country. We have worryingly high rates of domestic and family and sexual and gender-based violence. And that speaks to really very deep misogyny and attitudes towards women as chattels, that men can do whatever they like to. Fortunately, not the great majority of men, but a significant enough minority for this to be a problem in our society. And that, again, is not easily or quickly addressed, but it needs a lot of work done on it. So those would be the kinds of areas I'd be putting attention to.
Okay. This is from Matt Brennan. The charges against Julian Assange criminalized publishing secret documents revealing war crimes and torture, according to many legal observers and press freedom groups. How vital is press freedom to peace, and what diplomatic solutions would you suggest New Zealand could take to stand for Assange, who the UN and Amnesty International are calling to be freed from arbitrary detention, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture is saying is being tortured?
Well, I mentioned these special rapporteurs earlier, and they, I think, do have an important role as independent observers of what is happening. I mean, you do wonder when the hatchet can be buried with Assange, and not buried in his head, by the way, but at some point, could people move on? I mean, I do think that, probably the information that's been disclosed by whistleblowers down through the 80s has been very important, and broader public's getting to know what is really going on behind the scenes. And should people, pay this kind of price for that? I don't think so. So I'm not familiar with what the Special Rapporteur on Torture has said, but I'll certainly have a look at it. I mean, I felt that Chelsea Manning, for example, was really unduly repressed. And we have the young man whose name eludes me for the moment, who's still sitting in Moscow, having fled after dumping the tranche of documents. I mean, the real issue really is the activities they were exposing, not their actions of exposure.
Exactly. Shakil Shamal says, during your career, what was the most challenging decision you had to make in terms of conflict that was going on around the world?
Oh, I think the most challenging was Afghanistan, because it was quite a big call to send the SAS there, and it had quite serious ramifications for the government. Labor was in alliance with the Alliance. Jim Anderton is the leader, fully backed the decision, but there were many voices in the alliance against it, and I understand their reasons for that. And it did lead to the disintegration of the alliance, which then had a follow-on effect of calling an earlier election than there otherwise would have been, because you didn't know, really how much further that disintegration could go and what it would do to the government majority in Parliament. So that was a big call.
Good. Marin Barron says, Kia ora, Helen, the Security Council has failed the Palestinians multiple times for over 60 years. What's the mood among members for a single state solution now the two-state solution has essentially been overwhelmed by Israeli settlements?
Well, I'm one who wouldn't give up on the two-state solution, because what else is there? That had broad international acceptability. Two states living alongside each other in peace. Of course, it's been desperately hurt by the ongoing expansion of settlements. But I don't see the alternative. And I think that it would be nice if the Biden administration had another crack at this early on. What we've seen is for example, in the Obama administration attempts, or the Clinton administration, the attempts come much too late in the Democratic presidencies to get traction. And there must be at least a millimetre more space now in the post-Netanyahu era in Israel for at least broaching these issues. I think the UN has really been pretty much a side player in this. The action has been more US-Israel state of Palestine, and one would like to see the UN a bit more involved. But again, there hasn't been much room or space for it to get involved. Could the Biden administration change that? I don't know, but it is not even a frozen conflict, is it? It's an active conflict which deserves to be brought to an end in the interests of people of the two countries.
Bridget Chris from Pax Christianity Aroa says, question related to high sea fishing. What are your thoughts of human slavery on the high seas, that is, conditions aboard fishing vessels that permanently stay in international waters? How do we address the issue both nationally and internationally?
Well, short answer, I don't know. I mean, obviously it's shocking, and I've no doubt that you could describe some of the conditions as modern slavery, as the question says. I suppose the issue is, where are these boats flagged? What are the international human rights obligations and ILO convention obligations of the countries which flag these ships, and to try to focus attention back on that.
I can say, Kevin, that we have some legislation that's just passed its first reading in the House around marine powers, which addresses a lot of these questions. And it's tricky because there's human rights elements, there's elements around boarding vessels without warrants and so on. But I think there is a really strong case for strengthening New Zealand's ability to be able to do exactly that, as particularly in terms of our kaitiakitanga of the Pacific and the way we work with our Pacific neighbours.
Yeah. Thank you. Jeff Walker says, good morning from Gulu. How do you see the inevitable rise of Africa? I see here the West losing influence as others take a more influential role through covert political actions such as training regime leaders.
Hi, Jeff, in Gulu, northern Uganda, where I think it's about 9:45 in the morning. I think that Africa has been, in a sense, it's had the challenge of great powers from afar interfering in its affairs for centuries, and today is no different. But I think there's also some skepticism among African leaders, or many African leaders, as to whether they want one form of colonialism to replace another. I think the important thing is to support African institutions, the role of the African Union and its different mechanisms, the sub-regional institutions. Also to support countries to, if you like, improve the tools of governance which encourage quality investment and not subpar investment, to get the organs of the state working in a way which enables adequate fiscal and other policies to be pursued, so that countries aren't constantly in a cycle of high debt and bailouts and high debt and bailouts. You see a number of countries in that predicament. But in essence, I think my approach is developmental. What can be done to support stronger institutions, better governance, addressing the fundamental problems of human development, responsible economic management, political freedom. There's a lot of tools that can be used to support countries looking for a way forward, as many are. And let's not think it's all gloom and doom. There are a number of bright spots, and one would like to see more.
Okay, I think this question you've already answered in part. It's again on Afghanistan and an article you wrote in the ODT. And it said, you said 20 years wasn't long enough to change Afghanistan, and the US by application, New Zealand should have occupied Afghanistan for much longer, using the example of UN troops occupying the border between South and North Korea for nearly 70 years. Do you believe that we should have occupied Afghanistan for 50 years or more until their culture suited our ideas?
No, and I haven't used the word occupation, but I think if you look at the Korean Peninsula, where there's never been a peace agreement since the armistice in 1953, what enabled South Korea to be at least have the space to start to improve its human development, and let's face it, been pretty successful with that, was that it didn't face an ongoing threat of invasion because an international presence stayed there. I think the international presence which enabled Afghanistan, as I said, to sort of slowly inch forward was not substantial, and I think to just pull the rug under it, as happened, has left Afghanistan in a worse position than before. So that wasn't sensible. As I said, you can replay the record and look at where the whole endeavour went off the rails, from the failure to include the Taliban in 2002, in particular the averting of the gaze to Iraq, the failure to mobilise sufficient investment in development. There's a lot of failures along the way, but just sort of upping stakes and leaving, I don't think was the answer.
And I think probably this will be our final question from Angus Noon. Hey, Helen, do you think that China's current motivation to dominate the Asia-Pacific area could result in a war of conquest, and do you think that New Zealand would need to intervene?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily China's ambition. As I said before, China is a rising power. It's a great power. It's got a large economy. It's built its military, but will it use that military for aggressive purposes beyond what it historically sees as its territory, marine or land? I think that the sort of hooping up of war talk in the Pacific is really deeply worrying, and we have to row back from this and look at how we all engage China in a way that's constructive, while acknowledging that there's very significant differences in how we treat people within national boundaries. So yeah, I'm concerned, and I'm concerned that the latest AUKUS AU-KUS agreement is a sort of a step in the wrong direction. It's clearly aimed at China, but it's ruffled a lot of feathers, sent a lot of concern around.
Great. Before I call on Richard Jackson to issue a vote of thanks, I would just personally like to thank you and all the panel for the robustness of your answers and for sharing your own dilemmas and challenges as you've dealt with many of these issues, which are kind of quite critical to peace building in the 21st century. So over to Richard there to provide a vote of thanks on behalf of the Baxter Trust.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you so much, Helen, for your wonderful support of our trust, the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust. Thank you for supporting our annual lecture and agreeing to give up your obviously very precious time to speak to us today. We really appreciate that. And thank you so much for your insights and observations that have obviously been informed by almost a lifetime of working at the forefront of politics and international politics in the area of peace and development and justice and so on. And you've given us so many insights and so much food for thought as we all get ready for dinner. And we really appreciate the insights that you've given us. We also thank you for your evident and tireless commitment to peace and justice and progress around the world. It's obvious that you've committed your life to this, and you know, we appreciate that and we stand with you on that. And we're glad that you're part of our community here in New Zealand that's working on these issues. And then lastly, I would just like to thank you for your, I would say, cautious and pragmatic optimism about the opportunities and possibilities for global peace and justice. And in particular, as Kevin mentioned, your optimism about the role that civil society can play. You know, we're a civil society group, and your audience here, they're civil society as well, and we're all committed to the same thing. So it's really, it really gladdens our hearts that you think we can help and we can play a role in the high politics of the world, you know, through advocacy and adding our voice and working locally and so on to help bring about peace. So yeah, thank you so much on behalf of the Trust for giving this lecture. And we really wish you well with your own foundation and the work that you continue to do. And I don't know if Kevin's going to do this, but just to remind everyone that we're going to be opening the memorial on the 29th of October at 2:30 at the corner of George and Albany Street. And we hope that many of you will be able to join us there for that. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Trust and everybody else, I'd like to thank the 360 of you who have joined in on this webinar. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to address all of your questions, but you're able to see this again, and hopefully some of what Helen and Ingrid and Robert have said will kind of stimulate a thought on your part. But more importantly, I hope, as Rich has mentioned, I hope that this webinar has stimulated all of us to kind of increase our efforts to make sure that we ensure that Aotearoa New Zealand is a just and peaceful place, and our part of the world is just and peaceful, and that we really do grapple with all of the big issues that are on the table in multilateral, cooperative and peaceable ways. So once again, Helen, thanks for being there, and thank you, Ingrid, thank you, Robert, thank you, Richard, and thanks to the 360 of you who are listening in. I don't know how to clap in this sort of environment, but I will do so.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.